Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm checking out the GB110 from gearbest.com. Now I know what you're thinking, this looks bigger than a 110 and it actually is. It's 110 from motor to motor, but of course the main feature of this quadcopter is this cage that it's in. And this makes the quadcopter about a 140 to 150 size rather than a 110. So, as I mentioned, the feature of this one is the cage, and it's very similar to the Flex RC Lady Owl that I built. It's about the same size. However, this one is a little bit different, and that is because it's actually got DYS 1306 4000 kV motor, so it's a bigger motor. And the way that they have fitted this in is the propellers here, which are 3-inch propellers, they actually go over the top of the flight controller. Can you see there? So it's really difficult to fit everything in. So the flight controller is an SP Racing F3, which is the same as the Lady Owl. Now, the problem is, with the propellers going over the top of the flight control, it's very difficult to fit a receiver into it. You can't fit a receiver on top of there. So what I have done is I have taken a Lemon RX DSMX receiver and I have soldered it to the flight controller here, and I have fitted it up the front, just out of the way. So that's very difficult to do, and I'll overlay some footage here of the way that it looks, because what I actually liked about this is you can see there that we've got this top plate here, and in order to get to the flight control you don't have to take this entire top plate off. You can just take a hex driver and unscrew it here, and then you've got some standoffs here as well, and you can take that off, and it's quite easy to get to. Now the propellers, however, they're not that easy to get on because they actually are longer than this frame. So these are the DYS 3x3 3-leaf propellers, and you can see I've broken one there. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we've also got a video transmitter on the back here as well. It's 200 milliwatt, and you are also given a mushroom antenna, but I haven't used that. It is an SMA antenna, and I'll tell you why I haven't used that later. You're also given this lead as well, and I guess this is to plug into one of the UARTs at the back there if you want to use a FreeSky receiver. And you can use a FreeSky receiver, but you struggle to fit it in there. You'd have to put it at the side here or at the front like I have done. And that's all you get really. So you're going to need a transmitter, you're going to need some kind of video receiver or video goggles. So I'm using these Fat Shark Dominator V2 goggles with a diversity receiver, on-way antenna, and then with the transmitter I'm using my Tyrannus Plus with an Orange RX module, because this is a DSMX receiver. So you will notice that I have changed a couple of things, and I initially had some problems with this one. So when I set it all up, I took it for a fly, and it had some really odd flight characteristics. I'd be flying it around and I got a fairly nice tune out of it, so I installed Betaflight onto it, and all of a sudden it would just pitch backwards like that on its own and point to the sky. Probably got some footage of it doing that. I'll put it over the top. And I really didn't know what was doing it, because I haven't had that sort of characteristic before. Even with the Lady Owl and the Mini Owl, it didn't do that, but those are a much lighter setup, I've realised. And this one, it's fairly heavy. Got some top-notch components in there, especially with the battery as well. I should talk about the battery. So this will actually take a 4S quite comfortably. In fact, it didn't take a 3S as well as a 4S, and that's another problem that I had. A lot of my 3S batteries, they are not high discharge ones. I was using this one here, which is the battery that came with the JJ Pro P130. I thought that would be ample, so it's an 850 milliamp battery. But I was finding on full throttle that the motors were cutting out. And I thought maybe it's a timing issue. So the good thing about this is 20 amp ESCs, they're BL Halley. Not BL Halley S, but you can plug it into BL Halley Suite. And I changed the timing. These are high kV motors, 4000 kV. And sometimes the higher kV motor requires a higher timing setting in BL Halley. So I went into there and switched the motor timing to high. And the motor still stuttered on full throttle, so that wasn't the issue. I even tried the lower setting, it's still a problem. It wasn't a timing issue, it is the battery. It requires a really high capacity battery to run these motors because they're such high kV. So I switched the battery out to this 4-cell battery. Now it's not any particular make, I sourced it locally because I wanted to get this review out here, but it's a 850 milliamp 4-cell battery. It's a 50C to 100C burst rate, and this did the trick. So I had some other problems with this quadcopter though. As I say, the quadcopter kept pitching backwards whilst I was flying it, and I first of all wondered if it was a problem with the way that it was built, because under here there is a power distribution board with a 5-volt regulator in, and that regulator is connected to the flight controller, so it's powering the flight controller and the camera up the front as well. And I thought perhaps that both of these devices was drawing too many amps, and momentarily the flight controller was cutting out and it was pitching backwards. That wasn't the problem either. But yes, this camera at the front here is another problem with it as well. And you see there it's got this little carbon plate on it here, and out of the box it was on this second setting here. And I don't think they actually flew this when they built it, because it comes ready built, you don't have to build this thing, it's an ARTF. And in that second slot there, the props are catching this camera. So you have to have it angled right forward in order for it to not catch, and then again it is really close. And I've got this 808 camera on the top here, and I'll explain more about that in a bit. One thing that I didn't like about the camera is this little carbon plate here. It's so thin around these screws, so that's how it attaches there. And watch what happens. Click. And it sort of just snaps. In fact, mine was like that out of the box. And in that position, the propellers catch slightly on the camera, so bit of a design flaw there. I probably replace that out with something else, or cut my own plate or something like that. So yeah, bit of a problem there. Anyway, back to the quadcopter flipping backwards randomly. So I actually went as far as taking out the flight controller and putting in a new flight controller. Yeah, it cost me a fortune in money and time to get this one flying correctly, but it wasn't the flight controller either. And so I spent a while on the tuning. I thought maybe it's the tuning. I use my stock tune that I like to use with these sort of things, and I put the P gains too high, I put the D gain and the I gain too low, too high, and no matter what happened, it was still flip backwards. And so I sort of thought, well, maybe it's a balancing issue. It's just looking at the center of gravity here, and we have got a lot of weight at the back with this VTX, and a lot of weight at the front with this camera, and it was very tail heavy, which would explain it pitching back. So what I did was I put this lighter cloverleaf antenna on the back there, because this thing was just too heavy, and it's semi-rigid, so it sticks up, but that causes the quadcopter to be really tail heavy. So I decided the best thing to do was to push the VTX forward. So I did that. I cut this cable tie under here and pushed it forward, and I also stuck an 808 at the front, and that seemed to make it behave much better, but it didn't completely fix the issue, and I'll talk more about that in the test flight. So something else that I did do with this one is, you can probably see around here, I have installed a little buzzer here on the flight controller, and that is because when it kept pitching backwards, I kept losing it out there on the field, and so I set up a buzzer on a switch so that I could find it easily. So I also had to connect the VBAT up from the power distribution board to the flight controller, so I did that. And I also mentioned as well that I soldered on the wires here to the receiver as well. So I did quite a lot of soldering, so despite this being a ARTF, almost ready to fly, I didn't find that to be the case at all. Again, that's probably my receiver choice, and you don't have to stick a buzzer on there, but I would recommend it because no on-screen display with this one. So that's something else that I did. Another thing that I didn't really like is the battery strap as well. So you're using hefty batteries with this, and you're just given this flimsy battery strap here, and it's one of those that doesn't have any threads, so you have to sort of cross them over like that, and sort of, fits underneath there, and look, it's quite chunky, that quite funny looking as well. But you can see there, if I put my fingers on here, there, it balances out, and that's very important, I've realized, with this type of quadcopter, especially at this weight. You need to have the balance absolutely perfect, otherwise it's just not going to perform at all. So we've also got an XT60 under here, which is good because all 4S batteries are using an XT60. We've also got these landing legs under here as well. Now, they don't come low enough to protect the battery anyways. I guess if you use the smaller battery then it would do, but yeah, I could probably take these off. They didn't really do anything. They didn't break though. You'll notice underneath that I have got some screws missing on the motors here, and that's because I was flying it around, and this is why we have got a broken prop here. One of the motors came completely loose. So these don't have thread lock on them. So all of these screws on this motor came out, and I had a spectacular crash, but the only thing that was damaged was the propeller, because the motor was continuing to spin in here and it was catching against this here. And yeah, so what I did was I borrowed a couple of the screws from the other one. I used Loctite, and hopefully those won't come out again, because these motors absolutely scream. They are so noisy. So there's a lot of vibrations going on there. And these, when I used a screwdriver to unscrew them, they just came out so easily. So again, needs thread lock there, so that's something else that you need to do. So in my opinion, almost ready to fly? Not really. I mean, it was fully built up, but I had to do a lot of work with this one. But it looks really cool, and it's really well protected in this cage. So not really an indoor flyer though, I have to say. It's more for flying outdoors, and if you have a spectacular crash, then it's going to be protected. However, you can see there, the camera out the front definitely protrudes out there, so I think this plate's going to get smashed in a crash. You can see there, it sticks out. And of course, you've got this big battery underneath as well, and every time I crashed, the battery flew off somewhere. Another thing that would make this not a good indoor flyer is the fact that the spinners here come out of the top. Can you see there? So if you were flying indoors and smacked the ceiling, say, then that would definitely affect the motor. So the idea of this is that the motors are all caged and the propellers are, so you can bash into things and it doesn't really affect the flight characteristics of the quadcopter. But if you bashed into something vertically like that, then it's definitely going to affect how the motors are spinning. So again, another reason for not to fly it indoors. You might be thinking, why have they done that? But these motors are really long, and in order to get these powerful motors into this frame, that's just something that they had to do. I guess they could have made these standoffs a little bit longer here. So these standoffs, they do look like they are metal, maybe even brass. I'm not sure, maybe they're just coated, but definitely very strong. Perhaps they could have made them a little bit taller. So another thing I had to modify with this, and there was quite a lot of things, was the ESCs. Now, it wasn't a big deal, but I thought it was at the time because I was flying this around and all of a sudden this motor seemed to seize up. I would arm the quadcopter and it wouldn't spin, and when I was turning it by hand, there was no sort of clicks between the motor magnets, and I thought, great, I've been using a 4S and it's burnt the motor out, because these motors do get fairly hot. And by the way, they don't recommend that you use a 4S with this, but I had the best results with a 4S, so there you go. But what actually was happening was there's 3 wires coming from the motor there that goes into the ESC, and because this is so tightly packed in, what was happening was the ESC and wires were bunching up against the motor and causing it to seize. So it was a quick fix. You just have to put cable ties around the ESCs then that holds the ESC down and causes it to then miss the motor. But yeah, that was a tricky thing to figure out, but an easy fix. By the way, who would like to see me cut this cage off? And we have the smallest 110 quadcopter with a 4S. I bet that would be mad. I'll have to think about that because I'd have to stack the camera up here somehow, but I bet it would fly crazy like that. Now, I don't know if you can see here as well, but out of the box, this spinner seems to be slightly damaged. Now, I don't know if I've got a second-hand one here. I don't think so because, like I say, it wouldn't arm with that camera in that back position, so I don't think it's a problem. Anyways, there was a while where I thought maybe this was causing my pitching back problem, maybe with an aerodynamic issue, but it wasn't that. Now, I really would have liked to have seen some spare props with this, because now I've got to wait until some come in the post. But I guess they were thinking that you won't break a prop with this, but I managed to. I guess, you know, the only way that it was going to break was that motor coming loose there. So I'm going to have to wait until I can fly it again. But let's get into Betaflight and see the things that I changed to get this thing flying better. So here we are in Betaflight. I have already flashed the firmware to the SP Racing F3. I'm not going to show you how to do that. I've covered that in previous videos. You can see here that I have got the quadcopter plugged in via the USB port. Now this is something to note because it's so tightly packed in there. You have to have a really short USB lead. I took a USB cable and cut the connector away so that it bends really easily. So that's something that you have to bear in mind with these caged quadcopters. But you can see there that it says COM3, so I'm going to connect to it. And of course you calibrate the accelerometer here, and if we just go into ports here, you want the serial RX for UART3 selected if you have installed DSM2 or DSMX satellite. So let's go into configuration, because this is where I need to start talking about how I have set this up to fly nicely. So we've got One-Shot 125 selected here. I've got it to spin the motors when the quadcopter is armed, and this is what I want to talk about here, minimum throttle. And this is something that I've realized with this particular quadcopter, and that is, it does not like to lose a load of altitude quickly, and that is what is causing it to pitch back the most. A lot of it was to do with the balance, so you need to make sure that it's perfectly balanced, but it pitched back when the quadcopter lost a lot of altitude, and I think the reason for that is the fact that this cage that is around it is creating drag, and it's drag that the flight controller is not really designed to cater for. Now, I didn't have this with the Lady Owl and also the Mini Owl, and I think that's because it's a lighter setup, but also I set those up to be pushers rather than pullers, which means that there was less of the frame in the way of the propeller. So I think there's more drag here when the quadcopter is falling. So what I did was I set the minimum throttle to higher than it needed to be, so that the quadcopter would fall to the ground, but much slower than it would if it had a lower minimum throttle. So that's the first thing that I did. And of course I've got the max throttle set to 2000 here in the center at 1500. Now this is something that I also changed as well, the battery voltage, and I think this is something that I find a problem with Betaflight in general, is that when you do a punch out with a quadcopter and you've got a buzzer set up, the voltage sag on the battery will cause the beeper to go off momentarily, and I think there needs to be a little bit of a delay put into Betaflight there to stop that from happening. But what I do is I set the warning voltage a little bit lower than it should be. So it's set at 3.5 from standard. I've reduced it to 3.3, which seems dangerously low, but you see it only momentarily hits 3.5 volts and then it increases back up. So I find that if you set the warning voltage to 3.3, which is too low, it's only momentarily going to hit 3.3, and that's when your beeper's going to go off, and then you set the minimum cell voltage to 3.2, and then it's constantly going to go off. So that's something that I did. So down here for the receiver, because I'm using the DSMX receiver, it's set to Spectrum 2048. And another thing that I did here is I just changed the PID loop frequency to 2 kHz. I just did that while messing about to see if I could get it to fly a little bit better, but that didn't really do anything, and I just stuck with 2 kHz for both of them. However, you can see here air mode permanently on. Now, something that air mode does that I don't usually like with a quadcopter is that it causes it to descend very slowly. And this is something that works really well with this type of quadcopter. So I put that on, and between this and the minimum throttle, it almost completely eradicated that pitching back issue. So that was really cool, and that is the main thing that made this thing fly better. Now, I don't usually use air mode, but yeah, it worked well in this scenario. So I'll just go on to the PIDs as well, because this is something that I also changed. See that I've got my standard PIDs here, so that's 80 on the P there for the roll and 60 on the D and 45 on the I gain. Now for the pitch, which is where I had the problem, it was pitching backwards, I tried all sorts. I put the P too high to the point where it was stuttering when it was flying, but it was still pitched backwards. Same with the I, same with the D. So I put the P as high as possible, and it would fly fine at 120 there, and the I at 4.5, and the D slightly higher at 80 as well. And this seemed to be the best setting that I could find. I spent so long trying to tune this thing, and eventually it was really the air mode and the min throttle that got it flying better. So if you have bought one of these, hopefully I have done a lot of the work for you already if you're having problems getting it to fly. So I also set the yaw to 70 and 4.5 there as well. And this is actually, I'm using a version of Betaflight that is lower than the current version, so I think it's 2.91. So we've got this yaw jump prevention in here as well. I've got the Super 8 at 0.8 where I usually keep it, and I stuck a little bit of RC Expo in there as well to see if I could help with the control issues that I was having, but it didn't really. So that's all the settings in there, and then in the receiver tab, I've got it set to TAER1234 for my Tyrannus, and then under modes, I have also got arming on a switch, so 2-position switch, angle mode, horizon mode, and acro on a 3-position switch. You can see down here, I've set an auxiliary 3 up for a beeper for when it gets lost in the grass, and that happened quite a lot when it kept losing control. So that's about everything in there. I'll just go into the CLI so you can see the version that I'm using. 2.91, yeah, just as I thought. Again, it wasn't really the version of Betaflight that was the problem. No matter what version I used, it was a tricky one to set up, but there you go. That is everything that I did in Betaflight to get this thing going. So the next thing to do is to have a flight with it and see how it got on. So starting off with the DVR footage, and the first thing that I noticed is the slightly narrower field of view than I'm used to. It's about 90 degrees, but I quickly got used to it. Now you can hear the motors going there, and that is because the 808 camera is recording them, not the DVR. So I'm going to switch to the 808, and watch this punch out. It's an absolute monster. And when you come off the throttle, this is the descent that you get in air mode. So very slow, but sadly that's what this quadcopter needs in order to stay in the sky. So I'm just going to fly around here and do some tests to make sure I have eradicated that pitch problem. I'm going to flip back to the DVR footage now. And you can see that I can't fly forward very fast, and that is that camera angle. You will have to modify the camera if you want to change that. But I'm getting old and I like to fly fairly slow these days and do some freestyle, so it's perfect for me. So again, just doing some rolls to just make sure that the tune is nice. And here I'm going to do a backflip, and you can see that it doesn't get upset even though it's lost a fair amount of height. Now, it does show itself slightly, but it certainly doesn't render the quadcopter unflyable. So you can see there another backflip, flying absolutely fine. So I think this is the best that I'm going to get it unless I spend a lot more time with it. I spent around 4 days in total trying to get this one flying nicely, which you shouldn't have to do really. Now here I do a backflip, and again, nice and smooth recovery. That is what I was after. It would not do that before. Nice snappy rolls as well. Now if it lost too much height, it would have a slight problem on the pitch, and I think you see that in a bit. So I do a backflip there, and you can see there it just slightly pitches back as it recovers, but it doesn't fall out of the sky like it was doing before. So you got to have the perfect balance with this one, and you've also got to make sure that it doesn't lose too much height, otherwise it's going to cause too much drag on that frame and the flight controller is going to struggle to deal with it. And I'm sure I could spend more time on the tuning and get it better, but I felt like I'd spent a lot of time on it already. So, more punch outs here. Just listen how the thing screams. It is so loud. Even I was wincing how loud this was, and my neighbours are usually pretty good. You can hear when I come off the throttle there, the motors are on a high RPM, and that again is because of ammo, but they generally rev quite high anyway due to their high KV. And I go for a 4-point roll there, and you can see it slightly upsets it on the recovery, but again it doesn't fall out of the sky, so I think I have pretty much sussed that. Now this is the flight where the motor is slowly becoming loose, so you might hear some vibrations on the 808 camera. And yes, I couldn't hear them on the ground. I wish I could, otherwise I would have landed it. But you can see there again, coming off the throttle, a very slow descent. That's what you're after with this setup. So as I do the last couple of flips and rolls there before the crash, I just want to say I'll put a link in the description if you wish to get this one. However, it's got a lot of work to do before you can get it flying nice, and hopefully this video will help you. But as the aircraft tumbles out of the sky, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.